Hi everybody, Tyler here. So today I want to continue my conversation that I started on Sunday about the Beatles, and I want to talk to you about their album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Now, as I mentioned on Sunday, that album is kind of a cross between their earlier work, which is typified by songs such as "I'm Gonna Hold Your Hand," very, very sweet, but a little more simple songs, and their later music, which is typified by more psychedelic music and themes such as you might find in "I Am the Walrus," things like that. And I think this album really cuts a really good line between the two. Not too sweet, not too psychedelic. Now, I personally love this album. It's my favorite Beatles album, and I think it really does a great job of bringing the whole feel all together, really pulling everything into one really excellent piece. And I think you get a really good shot of that when you look at the intro song and the reprise at the end, the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band song and the reprise. It really frames the whole thing, and many people have actually said that this album is the first quote-unquote concept album. And I don't know that it's the first, but I do believe that it is the one that really set the mold for a lot of concept albums to come, such as Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, things like that, or The Wall, maybe, by the same band. So I think that it did a really good job of being a really excellent, cohesive work of art. And I think that when people listen to it, you get that kind of infectious, kind of upbeat pace to the music. But I think something that not everyone realizes is that a lot of that album is really, really dark. Now, of course, songs like She's Leaving Home are very evidently dark and sad, and there's not really a lot of, confusion about that. The lyrics are direct, and they are not exactly uplifting. But even other tracks, which at first glance seem kind of upbeat and happy, like With a Little Help from My Friends or When I'm 64, once you look at the lyrics a little bit more, they become darker and more, I want to say, just not exactly what you'd expect from a Beatles album. I mean, for instance, in the track With a Little Help from My Friends, it seems like this kind of peppy, upbeat track about getting high with your friends. But he says in the song, "I get by with a little help from my friends." Like he literally can't get through the day without help from his friends. And I think that's something that is kind of glossed over. When I'm 64, he talks about how, will you still love me when I'm 64? It's like, will you even still be there for me when I get older? Or is this just all very quick and fading? And so I think that is very well summed up in A Day in the Life, the last track. And you really see that sadness and that kind of darkness come to the forefront of the piece. And it's interesting to note that while this album had a huge impact in the music scene in terms of kind of setting the mold, creating this kind of vision for what concept albums look like, it also created a huge stir in the general public, as many people thought that Paul McCartney had died. In the first track, they say, it's like, let me introduce to you Billy Shears, who was the pseudonym that they used for the leader of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Now, of course, that is just a reference and just part of the whole concept album as a whole. It doesn't have any deeper meaning to it, especially in reference to Paul McCartney being dead, as he's one of only two Beatles who are still alive today. But it is just kind of a marker of how much of an influence the Beatles had on music at the time. I mean, there were news stories about how Paul was dead. There were people who would say, if you look at the cover, you can see the figure of Paul is looking down. He must be dead because of that. People were saying if you played part of A Day in the Life backwards at a certain speed, it would say Paul is dead. All these different things that really came out with no real basis were just all circulating because of this huge influence the Beatles had on music and pop culture at the time. And I think that this album is an incredible marker for that kind of power that the Beatles had. not only in terms of their musical development, but also in terms of music's development. They really changed how people view what music should be. It didn't necessarily have to have each track on the album be a standout single. I mean, there are tracks on Sgt. Pepper's which would never be a single, like Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. And even She's Leaving Home, that's a dark track, and I don't think that it would necessarily do very well as a single, but as a bigger part of this unit, this album, it does a really good job of conveying that emotion that they're going for with the whole piece. So I think that if you haven't given Sgt. Pepper a listen, or if you haven't listened to it in a while, as I'm sure many of you have listened to the album, and I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the Beatles' work, I would recommend giving it another listen. It has a lot of depth to it that you don't necessarily get at first blush. And I think that that is some of the beauty of the Beatles' work. While yes, they were transformative in how they changed music, and a lot of that is due to their harmonies and the way they put their music together, I think there's also a lot to be said about how their music has impacted other people based on the themes as well as the different ideas that are brought forward in their work, rather than just their harmonics or their guitar playing or their drumming or whatever you want to point to. So I would absolutely recommend giving this album another listen if you are familiar with it, and if you haven't listened to it, definitely give it a listen. It is absolutely worth it. Even 50 years later, it still stands the test of time. So with that, I'll let you guys go. I hope you guys all have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.